It began in the quiet darkness of the Tau Empire's frontier regions. An unassuming scrap of intelligence gleaned from a battered human archive station drifting amid the wreckage of a long-finished war. The Earthcast had rummaged through the station's data vaults, seeking to learn more about the Imperium's stunted technology and glean any secrets that might prove advantageous. Most of what they found were half-decoded fragments of prayers, litanies, dogmatic texts praising a corpse-like god, and worn historical manuscripts from centuries or millennia earlier. Buried in it all, though, lay a single mention of something beyond comprehension. The Golden Throne, a device so vital to human existence that even the slightest mention of its malfunction could apparently bring the vast Imperium to the brink of collapse. Such a revelation set in motion wheels of Tau ambition that turned rapidly behind the scenes. The Tau Empire, eternally guided by the principle of the greater good, sought always to expand. Their great hope lay in the assimilation of other species, harnessing knowledge, forging alliances, and, when all else failed, warring for the ultimate unity of the stars. But the human Imperium was daunting in scale, a behemoth whose territories knew no end. The Tau were well aware that to challenge such a massive, rigid civilization required not only cunning but a method to undermine the Imperium from within. If they could locate this Golden Throne, perhaps they could discover its secrets, turn them to the Tau's advantage, and rewrite the galaxy's power structure in the name of the greater good. And so it was that Commander Falsotek, a fire-caste commander noted for unorthodox tactics, found himself at the heart of a clandestine mission. Under orders from the highest echelons of the Ethereal Council, he was to slip into the Imperium's domain, disguised among the chaotic swirl of warp storms and the Imperium's perpetual conflicts. With him traveled an elite cadre of Tau and allied auxiliaries, Krut mercenaries, Vespid stingwings, and a handful of Guvesa, human defectors who had embraced the Tau cause. Their mission, to follow every clue from that battered archive station, to determine if the Golden Throne was real, and if so, to locate it. Many Tau found it outlandish to believe in something as archaic as a god on a throne. But Falsotek, ever pragmatic, suspected that behind the superstition lay technology of extraordinary potency. He was certain that, if the Tau could harness it, their empire would stand unassailable. Even so, he was no fool. The Imperium was monstrous in scale and infiltrating Terra itself. Should that prove the location of the Golden Throne, was a notion that courted suicide. Yet the possibility stirred something in his blood. He knew that if they succeeded, the Tau might rise to overshadow even the oldest powers of the galaxy. Boarding his sleek starship, the Light of SNAR, he examined a star map flickering across a hollow display. The route marked by painstaking intelligence gleaned from the ancient data vault. An unusual hush lingered in the corridors, for each soldier and operative aboard knew that the slightest miscalculation could doom them all. In their hearts, however, they believed in the cause. They believed that the Tau had the right to stand atop the galaxy's power structures and bring order to the endless conflicts that ravaged entire civilizations. They embarked. The route demanded that they pass near worlds swathed in the gloom of the Imperium's domain. Warp storms, swirling with malignant energies, cut great swathes of territory off from easy travel. But the Tau had learned much about traveling through the labyrinth of warp-driven routes, albeit carefully, for their technology was not the same as the Imperium's. Their advanced thrusters and stable, if limited, warp drives gave them a precarious advantage. Their approach often went undetected. Imperial detection grids were oriented toward the more savage warp signatures of Chaos or the typical warp distortions of Imperial fleets, not the delicate, minimal warp disturbance produced by Tau vessels. Still, detection was a constant threat, for the Imperium had watchers everywhere. Falsotek called briefings every shift cycle, each time scanning for new intelligence or warnings that the Imperium might have discovered them. He was meticulous, collecting the meager scraps from each infiltration and collating them. An offhand mention by a captured Imperial pilot, a cryptic cargo route rumored to transport relics from an ancient seat of power, or the whispered words of a terrified Guvesa who had once glimpsed the throne world of Terra. Gradually, he gathered something resembling a trajectory across the stars, a line that pointed inevitably to the Sol system, heart of the Imperium. Commander Falsotek knew that if the Golden Throne lay anywhere, it would be there on humanity's cradle. the planet that had birthed their kind millennia ago. A world shrouded by unthinkably dense defenses, ringed by fleets, protected by fortress moons, and overshadowed by the presence of the Emperor himself. Even in the rumored half-dead state in which he resided, tethered eternally to this throne, Falsotek found it difficult not to be impressed at the raw scale of the Imperium's reverence. The humans worshipped this emperor as a god in all but name. If that worship held no truth, why did so many billions dedicate themselves to preserving this single man? Curiosity gnawed at him, driving him forward. At last, the day came when the light of VSNAR and its escort ships slipped through the outer edges of the Sol system. The infiltration was a dance of stealth technology, coded signals, and impeccable timing. The Tau ships were dwarfed by the massive traffic of Imperial vessels converging on the system. Military convoys, merchant fleets, pilgrim ships, Adeptus Mechanicus Ford ships, inquisitorial black cruisers. So many threads weaving together in the heart of the Imperium. A lesser infiltration would have been detected within hours, but Falsotek's crew came prepared. The Tau's advanced sensor-baffling technology, combined with the infiltration of local Imperial comm channels by their Guvesa, allowed them to slip past the enormous detection nets. Still, tension weighed heavy in every corridor as they pushed deeper, always a heartbeat away from discovery. Arriving in the vicinity of Terra itself was akin to stepping into a fortress. Macridge itself was known for formidable defenses, but Terra was in a league of its own. Orbital battle stations, Titan-scale weapon platforms, entire battle fleets in permanent orbit. The planet's surface glowed with hive lights, layered spires, and the psychic emanations of a populace in the hundreds of billions. Falsotek could almost feel it, an electric press of presence that threatened to unsteady even a disciplined Tau mind. Among the fire cast, discipline was everything, and it took all his training to maintain composure as his gaze fell upon the swirling patterns of satellite arrays, watchful sensor webs, and ominous battle barges. This was not a world to be trifled with. To land undetected seemed almost impossible. Yet that was precisely his mission, and so the Tau employed cunning. They discovered an inbound pilgrim fleet that had endured damage from a warp storm, drifting and partially in distress. Its escorting Navy vessels were far too busy to check on every small craft. With quick, surgical strikes, the Tau commandeered one of the smaller Imperial transports, a battered cargo hauler designated the Saint's Hope. The Imperials aboard were subjugated swiftly. A hush fell upon them when the Tau quietly threatened them with annihilation should they resist, but also offered them the chance to live and serve anew. Confusion and fear reigned among the humans, but they surrendered. The cargo hauler continued its course, this time with a Tau infiltration team hidden in shielded compartments, while the rest of Falsotek's small fleet remained concealed in the void, waiting for a signal. The Saint's Hope passed through multiple layers of orbital scans. The Tau infiltration specialists, deft at forging codes, aided by the knowledge of the Guvesa, managed to keep the disguise plausible. It was a precarious situation. Any slip in protocol, any suspicious detail, might draw the attention of the Imperium's defenders. They answered routine communications in Low Gothic, forging the sign of the Aquila when required, mimicking the piety that accompanied pilgrim traffic. The Tau themselves stayed out of sight, trusting their human collaborators to do the talking. Finally, the cargo hauler was granted permission to descend to Terra's surface, escorted down through the thick atmosphere by wing after wing of Imperial craft. The infiltration team prayed silently to the greater good that this final step would not betray them. They touched down at a small spaceport near the outskirts of one of Terra's lesser hive regions, an area overshadowed by mountainous spires of ancient cathedrals and forges. Here, billions lived, worked, worshipped, and died without ever glimpsing the galactic horizon. The Tau infiltration team carefully set about blending in. They had to move quietly, for the watchers of the Adeptus Arbites and the might of the Adeptus Custodes themselves were rumored to walk the capital. Yet if the Tau stayed huddled in the ship, they would learn nothing. They needed local intelligence, needed to discover how to reach the seat of the Golden Throne. As the infiltration began, the Tau wore subtle disguises whenever possible, though with their unique features, hooves, blue skin, lithe physiques, They could only pass for human from a distance or in heavy cloaks. The Gyuvesa proved invaluable, slipping into crowds and gleaning scraps of rumor. The Krut could shift their posture and wear hoods, while the Vespid rarely ventured out, reliant on specialized breathing gear. Only those Tau trained in infiltration, known as watercast agents or stealth experts, took the greatest risks, careful to move under the thick pollution that shrouded the lower levels of the hive sprawl. Commander Falsotek was not one to idle aboard the ship. He joined carefully selected infiltration operations, always mindful of the chain of command. At night, hidden among the labyrinth of decrepit streets, they witnessed a horrifying testament to Terra's condition. Endless lines of emaciated pilgrims shuffled by, chanting the Emperor's name, weeping tears of blood from self-inflicted wounds. The Tau found it difficult to suppress their revulsion at such a mass demonstration of fanaticism. They were not naive. They knew human cultures often displayed strange behaviors, but witnessing the extremes on Terra itself was unsettling. Falsotek's infiltration cells discovered that the Golden Throne, physically housed in the Sanctum Imperialis of the Imperial Palace, was nearly impossible to approach. Walls soared hundreds of meters high, layered with battlements and ringed by the legendary Adeptus Custodes, genetically engineered guardians who existed solely to protect the Emperor. Billions of soldiers from the Astra Militarum, countless Adeptus Mechanicus priests, and roving squads of Adeptus Astartes also frequented the palace grounds. It was one of the most heavily guarded locations in the galaxy, if not the most. But the infiltration cells also heard rumors, barely whispers, of how, every so often, high-ranking tech priests from Mars or specialized officials from certain imperial offices gained limited access to the palace to see to the Golden Throne's upkeep. It dawned on the Tau infiltration teams that the Golden Throne, though revered, was also in dire need of maintenance. The centuries had taken their toll, and the Imperium's resources were stretched thin. Tech priests toiled endlessly to keep the device functioning, pumping psychic energies from the Emperor, or sustaining the Emperor's own failing form, an enigma at the center of the entire Imperium. If there was a vulnerability, it might lie in this constant cycle of repair, a constant need for specialized materials. But forging the credentials to become part of a Mechanicus detail was far more difficult than hijacking a small cargo ship. The Tau needed more detailed infiltration, higher-level infiltration than they had ever achieved. Days turned into weeks and weeks into cycles of data gathering. The infiltration teams slowly mapped out patterns. Where supply lines entered the palace, which tech priest cohorts arrived, who was authorized to speak the litanies of repair. They found themselves in the rotting underbelly of Terra, forging alliances with minor criminal elements who were too desperate to care about the Tau's strange appearance, so long as the Xenos paid well and asked few questions. Step by step, they pieced together the labyrinth of the Imperial Palace's outskirts. The infiltration was a delicate web, and more than once, a Tau or Krut agent went missing, swept up by the watchful Adeptus Arbites or perhaps discovered by the savage gangs who prowled the sublevels. Disappearances were a grim reminder that every day on Terra was a day dancing near the furnace of Imperial zeal. Eventually, a breakthrough came. One of the Gyuvesa, a woman named Lara, had once served as a scribe within the bowels of an Adeptus Mechanicus outpost. She recognized some of the codes that the tech priests used, symbols that indicated specialized maintenance rights for the Golden Throne. Using her knowledge, the infiltration team identified a small cohort of tech priests scheduled to travel from a sub-temple on Terra's surface up to the palace itself. The Tau realized they might intercept this group, replace them using advanced infiltration suits, and enter the palace under the guise of tech priests. It was a tremendously risky plan, because the Mechanicus had extensive security protocols, and the Tau would be forced to replicate them perfectly. Nonetheless, Falsotek set it into motion. The infiltration would involve a carefully timed ambush in the labyrinthine sewers beneath the subtemple, a swift and quiet neutralization of the Mechanicus entourage, and then the use of the Tau's most advanced holodisguise technology. Earth-caste scientists had spent months perfecting mimicry devices. The Tau infiltration suits were designed to mask life signs and replicate the cold bionics that the tech priests often possessed. It would not hold up to intense scrutiny or sophisticated scanning, but hopefully, within the confusion of the immense palace traffic, it would suffice. A hush descended upon the infiltration teams the night of the ambush. They gathered in a slimy tunnel where runoff from an archaic filtration system poured in. The air stank of rot and machine oil. The tech priests approached, two magi attended by a half-dozen robed servitors and lesser adepts. In a flurry of motion, the Tau strike overcame them. The tech priests barely had time to shriek a few binaric syllables before their throats were slit by Krut mercenaries, and the servitors were disabled by precise pulse blasts. Working quickly, the infiltration team stripped the tech priests of their robes, their holy symbols, and any data wafers that might serve as identification. The Tau illusions had to be rapid and thorough. Falsotek supervised, feeling the urgency thrum in his veins. Once disguised, the infiltration team reported to the subtemple for departure, feigning silence as if they were stoic, augmented Mechanicus officials. Another tech priest cohort was joining them, 8 living humans or what remained of them under all the bionics, and they all boarded an armored ground transport headed for the upper spires. Alarms itched at the Taoist minds. At any moment, someone could detect that something was amiss. But the Mechanicus rarely engaged in small talk, and the Tau infiltration suits broadcast faint binaric clicks that mimicked normal tech priest chatter. Their reticence was explained away by the dogmatic beliefs of the cult Mechanicus. None of the actual tech priests seemed suspicious of the new arrival's silence. Up through the spires they traveled, passing entire armies of pilgrims. All around them soared the colossal ramparts of the imperial palace, dotted with statues of saints and gargoyles, while lines of Adeptus Custodes patrolled ramparts overhead, their golden armor gleaming beneath the polluted sunlight. Defensive turrets bristled on every wall, and robed scribes chanted litanies of vigilance. The ground transport reached a heavily fortified gateway, one of many that led into the interior of the palace complex. Armored gates parted. A labyrinth of corridors and colonnades awaited, each thronged with officials, soldiers, menials, and more. It was a city within a city, a fortress of legend, and at its far interior, the Sanctum Imperialis held the Emperor's physical body. As they exited the transport, the Tau infiltration team marched in step with the real tech priest cohort, the Taoist hearts pounding within their chests. They had made it inside. Yet the fortress around them exuded an impenetrable aura. If they encountered a single misstep, retribution would be swift. As disguised tech priests, they followed their Mechanicus hosts through winding corridors, each corridor layered with Baroque engravings and watchful servoskulls that bobbed overhead, scanning for threats. The Tau infiltration suits projected the illusion of recognized bionic signatures, fooling the servoskulls, at least for now. But the team could not relax. They needed to find a direct route toward the Golden Throne's maintenance areas. A stroke of luck came in the form of an official assignment, delivered to the group by a senior engineer who hailed them in binaric code. Lara, well-versed in such transmissions, recognized the gist of the instructions. The tech priest cohorts were to report to a mid-level sanctum where an ongoing ritual of maintenance would soon take place, part of the daily rites that sustained the Emperor's life support. This was it, the infiltration team's best chance to get close to the Golden Throne. They began their trek deeper into the palace. Corridor after corridor, chamber after chamber, they beheld wonders and horrors alike. Some corridors gleamed with near-futuristic technology, where the Mechanicus busily maintained arcane devices that hummed with power. Other sections were archaic, almost medieval in design, filled with crumbling masonry, flickering torches, and cherub servitors chanting ceaseless praise. The infiltration team, for all their training, found themselves quietly awed by the monumental scale of it all. This was the seat of the Imperium, a place that had been built over millennia, layered with the legacy of untold billions. As they approached the mid-level sanctum, the tension in the air grew tangible. Guards in the black and silver of the Adeptus Custodes stood watch at key junctions. Their eyes shone with inhuman perception, scanning each passerby. Some carried guardian spears that glowed with lethal energy. The infiltration team's illusions might fool a standard servitor or lesser official, but if a custodes grew suspicious, the game would be over. The Tau made certain to keep their posture exactly as a tech priest might, walking with mechanical precision, speaking only in binaric or not at all. Finally, they reached the mid-level sanctum, which opened into a wide hall lined with intricate stained glass windows, each depicting some ancient scene from humanity's past. The Emperor leading armies in the Great Crusade, the thunderous might of the Space Marines, the traitorous revolt of Horus, and the battered remains of the Emperor enthroned for all time. The infiltration team took their place among the ranks of other tech priests and servitors, forming a half-circle around a central dais. In the dais's center, a large mechanical apparatus was guarded by more tech priests in higher office. This was, apparently, an auxiliary node that linked to the main mechanisms of the Golden Throne itself. Even so, the Tau were not yet in the presence of the throne. They needed to go further still. Lara carefully monitored the binaric chatter floating among the tech priests, gleaning scraps of meaning from the encrypted machine cant. Something about a conduit realignment, references to Psykers, talk of the Great Rift, and ominous mention of the Emperor's failing aura. The infiltration team realized that the Golden Throne was not only vital, it was failing in ways the Imperium dared not confess. The Mechanicus labored to patch it daily, feeding thousands of Psykers into arcane machinery to sustain the Emperor's beacon known as the Astronomicon. If the Tau could sabotage this system, the Imperium might unravel. The stakes were enormous, but Falsotek was no wanton butcher. He had no desire to cause a galactic apocalypse, only to weaken the Imperium enough for the Tau to secure a definitive advantage. And perhaps, if the Tau learned how the throne worked, they could replicate a version of it. That would be the ultimate prize. By controlling a reliable form of warp navigation or even harnessing a limited form of psychic power, the Tau Empire would leap centuries ahead in a single stroke. The infiltration team decided to press on, deeper, though the path to the Golden Throne's sacred presence was fraught with danger. The next day, the infiltration group was assigned to accompany a higher-ranking Muggos to a deeper region closer to the throne. A portion of the mid-level sanctum's conduits required direct inspection, and the Tau's illusions, still holding, would move with the Mechanicus retinue. Tension mounted with every step. Custodes' checkpoints dotted the corridors like an unbroken chain. At one checkpoint, a tall custodian with a gilded helmet stepped forward, scanning the tech priests. The infiltration suits worked in overdrive, broadcasting layers of binaric identification. There was a heartbeat of dread. Would the custodian's gene-forged senses detect the Tau beneath? Yet the warrior merely nodded, stepping aside. The infiltration team, hearts pounding, moved on. They entered a colossal antechamber dominated by massive gates. The gates towered upward, carved from the strongest alloys, inlaid with gold filigree, and covered in imperial iconography. Beyond lay the Sanctum Imperialis proper. The infiltration group was not authorized to pass this boundary, as only select individuals could approach the Emperor's physical location. So near, yet still beyond their grasp. Falsotek felt a burning frustration. If they could not get inside, all their infiltration would be for naught. Then something unexpected happened. A deep hum reverberated through the air, and emergency klaxons began to ring out. Tech priests and soldiers scurried as the palace walls vibrated with the threat of invasion. Had the infiltration been discovered? In the confusion, a broadcast crackled over the internal Vox systems. It mentioned an incursion by a warband of chaos cultists in the lower spires, an infiltration attempt by some heretical faction. The Tau infiltration team realized that although it was not they who had been discovered, the chaos caused by this assault might offer an opportunity. In the swirl of confusion, one might slip into restricted areas. Without speaking a word, Falsotek and the infiltration team veered off from the designated path, blending into the torrent of tech priests who were racing around, offering mechanical invocations to quell the threat. Meanwhile, squads of Adeptus Custodes marched past. The Tau ducked under archways, moving deeper into the restricted corridors that led toward the Emperor's presence. In the tumult, they reached an imposing gate marked with wards of the Adeptus Custodes and the Sigillite's personal sigil, partially ajar as a group of robed individuals scuttled through. The infiltration team seized the moment to slip behind them. They found themselves in a vast corridor that seemed to stretch for kilometers, every inch carved with inscriptions. The gloom pressed in from vaulted ceilings. As they advanced, the presence of Custodes' patrols intensified. They had to move in the shadows, relying on the confusion of alarms to remain undetected. On occasion, a custodes would sprint by, ignoring them for the more pressing threat of chaos cultists that had reportedly infiltrated from another direction. The infiltration team pressed on, guided by an almost magnetic sense that the Golden Throne was near. Lara's scanner picked up enormous energy readings from the far end of the corridor, and the faint whisper of psychic emanations made even the Taoist non-psychic minds feel a prickling dread. At last, they arrived at a final gateway. It was smaller than the colossal palace gates behind them, but heavily reinforced and guarded by 2 custodes standing at rigid attention. Through a crack in the half-open door, they glimpsed flickering golden light. The infiltration team crouched behind a fallen pillar, reviewing their options in hushed Tau language, always watchful that no servoskull hovered near. Getting past 2 custodes was a tall order, even for the best infiltration cadre. But fortune, or the sudden assault by chaos agents, arrived in the form of a tremor that shook the hallway, causing rubble to fall from the ceiling. The 2 custodes at the door pivoted sharply, receiving a sudden Vox transmission. One turned to his comrade and nodded. Then both sprinted down the corridor toward the sound of fighting, leaving their post to help repel the incursion. The infiltration team exchanged glances. Such a stroke of luck seemed uncanny, yet they would not squander it. Quiet as wraiths, they advanced on the door. It was not locked, but it was sealed with layered sensors. The infiltration suits attempted to mimic the relevant signals. At first, the door refused to budge. They tried again, employing the stolen credentials from the Tech Priest data wafers. There was a chime, and the door opened just enough to admit them. Beyond lay a sight that none of them would ever forget. The hallway gave way to a vast chamber whose ceiling soared out of sight. Pillars of gold and marble lined the perimeter, each the size of a fortress tower. Incense filled the air, thick with the pungent aroma of sacred oils and the tang of ozone. In the center of the chamber stood the Golden Throne, bathed in a blinding aura of psychic energy. The mechanical construct was immense, a towering seat built of ancient technology, cables, arcane apparatus, and the bones of what must have been starships. Atop it sat a figure, silent and unmoving, clad in golden armor that had fused with rotting flesh over 10,000 years. The Emperor of Mankind. An indescribable pressure settled upon the Tau infiltration team as they beheld this ruinous majesty. The Emperor's body was a husk, skin blackened and withered, an immobile corpse by all appearances, yet psychic might radiated from him like a roaring cosmic storm. The Tau had no gods and they disdained superstition, but in that moment, each infiltration team member felt a tremor in their soul. Some intangible presence pressed against their minds, not a conscious will but a swirling ocean of raw power that threatened to drown them. Around the throne, conduits and tubes slithered across the floor, pumping vital energies. A congregation of tech priests, adeptus custodes, and solemn-robed figures, likely sisters of silence or silent companions, tended to the Emperor's needs. None had noticed the Tau infiltration team yet, hidden in the shadows near the chamber's edge. Lara and the others recorded everything with scanning devices, capturing footage that might prove invaluable to the Tau Empire. Falsotek's heart pounded as he took in the monstrous contraption. This was no mere seat, no simple mechanism of life support. The Golden Throne pulsed with an almost living presence, bridging the Emperor's psychic might to the warp, sustaining the Astronomicon that lit the galaxy like a psychic beacon. Falsotek wondered, in a moment of clarity, if he was witnessing the greatest technological feat in the galaxy. Part warp device, part living conduit, part relic from the dark age of technology, it defied comprehension. And there, entombed, was the Emperor, revered by billions, father to the legendary Prime Arcs, sustained by 1,000 souls sacrificed each day. The Tau infiltration team realized. Every rumor of atrocities committed to keep this rotting demigod alive seemed confirmed by the presence of massive psychic pylons where lines of catatonic psychers were being funneled in. The Tau found it horrifying. Yet they also felt something akin to pity for a civilization so desperate to hold onto a legacy that it would chain itself to such a monstrous device. If the infiltration team had left at that moment, they would have achieved their primary objective. to see the Golden Throne and confirm its reality. But the Tau were always searching for an advantage. Some flicker of desire tugged at them. Could they sabotage the throne or replicate its technology? They lacked the tools for full sabotage, and a direct attack would doom them. But perhaps they could glean a schematic. The infiltration suits, though, could not decode the complex interactions of the device from a distance. They needed direct interface with the throne's lesser conduits or data ports. The risk was enormous. As they hovered at the edges, the infiltration suits still mimicking tech priest silhouettes, a hush fell across the chamber. The robed attendants began a ritual chant. Their voices rose in a crescendo that resonated through the throne's metal bones. Pulses of golden light flared, dancing across the emperor's motionless armor, flickering in the sunken hollows of his eyes. The psychic pressure increased until some of the Tau had to fight the urge to cry out. They steadied themselves. The robed attendants parted, revealing a tech priest who approached a console near the throne's base. He produced a gleaming key, inlaid with the imperial Aquila, and inserted it into a recessed slot. Machinery whirred, and a section of the throne's dais opened, revealing a cluster of control mechanisms. That was it, an interface perhaps linked directly to the throne's functioning. If the infiltration team could access it, they might download priceless data, maybe even glean how the Imperium maintained the Astronomicon. But that console was surrounded by guards. The Tau stilled, not daring to move. The ritual continued. The tech priest manipulated the controls, chanting a litany of maintenance. The golden aura around the throne flickered more violently. A wave of psychic energy pulsed outward, staggering a few Tau as they struggled to remain upright. In the corner of his eye, Commander Falsotek saw Krut ally double over, nearly losing control of his disguised facade. If they drew attention, it was over. Amid the swirling incense, some abrupt new presence manifested. A figure clad in the Baroque golden plate of the Adeptus Custodes stepped forward, but his armor was different, more ornate. He was easily 2 heads taller than the average soldier. This had to be a high-ranking member of the Custodes, perhaps even a captain general. The Tau recognized the danger. Then, behind him, stepped another figure. Draped in robes, face hidden behind a silver mask, he radiated a psychic stillness that was unsettling. The Tau infiltration team realized with dread that this masked figure might be one of the Emperor's personal attendants, perhaps a senior member of the Silent Sisterhood or some other secret order, for no psychic presence radiated from him, as though he were a null. The Tau infiltration suits could not conceal them from a null's scrutiny indefinitely. They had to move, either retreat or do something drastic. But the moment for retreat was fast slipping away. The Tau infiltration suits might fail under such intense psychic or anti-psychic presence. The infiltration team's hearts pounded as the chanting tech priests continued, the console whirring. Commander Falsotek looked to Lara, whose face was taut with concentration. She gave a minuscule nod, indicating that she could attempt a remote infiltration of the console from their current position, using a short-range data link embedded in her gear. It was extremely risky, but if successful, it might yield partial data on how the throne functioned. They had no time to debate. Falsotek gave a short nod, and Lara began her digital infiltration. She initiated a stealth data surge, projecting Tau infiltration code in binaric pulses that piggybacked on the tech priest's own transmissions. The rest of the infiltration team stood in a tight cluster, forming a half-circle so as to block any watchers from seeing Lara's subtle motions. Every second felt like an eternity. The massive Custodes figure paced around the perimeter, scanning for threats. The silver-masked null glided quietly, an aura of unnatural emptiness radiating from him. The Tau infiltration suits flickered, their illusions struggling. If that figure drew too close, the illusions would likely fail. Meanwhile, the Golden Throne's internal mechanisms hummed as the tech priest's ritual concluded. Lara's infiltration codes snaked through the console's defenses, encountering labyrinthine layers of encryption. Her brow beaded with sweat, but she pressed on. A silent beep on her suit's display signaled partial success. She had accessed the perimeter data logs on the throne's maintenance subroutines. But to go deeper, to access the main system, would require more time and a specialized encryption algorithm that she simply did not have on hand. She extracted what she could, a compressed data chunk that might prove invaluable to the Earth cast back in the Tau Empire. Then the silver-masked figure turned. His head tilted in the infiltration team's direction. Falsotek felt a spike of dread. The figure took several steps toward them, the robed attendants parting wordlessly. The infiltration suits struggled to project illusions against the null's unnatural aura. The Tau realized their facade was faltering. Panic set in. If they were discovered now, they would be slaughtered in moments. The infiltration team risked everything on one desperate gamble. In perfect unison, they slipped back toward the door, attempting to mirror the movement of real tech priests stepping out of the antechamber. Their hearts hammered as they passed from the direct glow of the throne's aura. The silver-masked null quickened his pace, suspicion evident in the tilt of his head. The infiltration suits began to crackle with distortion, failing. Some illusions fizzled around the edges, revealing flashes of blue Tau skin or the avian features of a Krut muzzle. In that instant, the masked figure hissed in alarm, raising a slender staff of black metal. The infiltration team had no choice but to run. They broke into a sprint, illusions flickering away, revealing their true forms. The guards in the chamber shouted, voices booming in high Gothic. Energy bolts seared across the space, and a custodes roared. One of the Tau infiltration members was cut down by a golden flash of the Guardian Spear, his body disintegrating. Another infiltration agent, a Krut, tried to return fire but was obliterated in an instant by the custode's superhuman reflexes. Chaos erupted. The Tau charged through the door, hurling grenades behind them in a desperate attempt to slow pursuit. Explosions tore the air, sending swirling debris and half the door's frame crashing down. Still, the unstoppable silhouettes of the custodes advanced. Now the infiltration team raced through corridors that had become killing fields. Alarm klaxons blared more urgently than ever. The entire palace put on high alert. Custodian patrols converged, determined to contain or eradicate this Xenos infiltration. The Tau had never faced the custodes in open combat. They learned quickly how outclassed they were. Fire cast training was formidable, but the custodes were genetic demigods, each warrior an army unto himself. If not for the fact that the Tau had sown confusion earlier, and that chaos infiltrators were also rampaging in some other sector, they would have been cornered immediately. Instead, they managed to weave through side corridors, leaving behind remote explosives to hamper pursuit. Commander Falsotek led them on a twisting route, guided by the partial palace schematics they had compiled. The infiltration team was now less than half its original strength. Several had fallen to the custodes' unstoppable fury. The survivors were battered and desperate, their illusions gone. They had to escape or all the data they'd gathered would die with them. They encountered squads of Imperial soldiers in steel-gray flak armor who opened fire, but the Tau used their superior mobility to vault over barricades, unleashing controlled bursts from pulse rifles. Vespid stingwings soared overhead, diving with lethal crystal guns that tore through the startled guards. The Tau pressed forward, searching for any route back to the outside. The deeper they fled, the more they realized they were traveling in circles. Entire corridors were locked down by enormous blast doors. The infiltration suits had partial codes to some areas, but in the wake of the alert, everything was sealed. Lara and a handful of infiltration specialists hacked doors on the fly, but the delays were costly. At one such door, a custodes crashed through the hallway from behind, swinging a power sword that glowed with lethal energy. He cleaved 2 Krut in half before the Tau could react. Falsotek and the others poured pulse fire into his golden armor, but the beam pulses barely scratched it. The unstoppable warrior advanced, face impassive. His blow severed the arm of another infiltration operative, who collapsed in agony. Only a hastily hurled fusion grenade forced the custodes back, searing part of his armor and knocking him against the wall. Even then, he rose furious. The Tau had just enough time to slam the blast door shut, locking him behind them with reinforced clamps. They pressed on, hearts pounding, knowing that the unstoppable Golden Warriors would soon find another route. More alarms blared. The infiltration team's comms crackled with frantic messages from any survivors across the palace. Most had been pinned down or wiped out. Falsotek cursed under his breath. The mission was on the verge of total catastrophe. The Tau had come so close. They had glimpsed the throne and gleaned some data, but now they were trapped inside the strongest fortress in the Imperium. Then, as if from the shadows, a figure materialized. A robed woman with pale skin, ocular implants, and the faint markings of a servoskull swirling around her shoulder. She raised a finger to her lips, signaling the Tau to be silent. The infiltration team raised their rifles, uncertain if this was an enemy. The woman whispered in a heavily accented low Gothic that she had no love for the Imperium and that she could guide them to a secret exit if they would take her with them. Falsotek frowned, uncertain if this was a trick. But the woman appeared to know exactly what she was doing. She beckoned them to follow her through a hidden side passage. The infiltration team, lacking better options, followed warily. Their mysterious guide led them through a labyrinth of narrow corridors, some of which were half forgotten or abandoned. It seemed she possessed knowledge of the palace's hidden ways, possibly gleaned from a previous infiltration or from forbidden archives. At times, they heard the thunder of footsteps nearby, the bark of orders, the hum of grav lifts. But guided by this woman, they managed to avoid direct confrontation. Finally, they emerged onto a balcony overlooking a subterranean docking bay, where a cluster of craft was kept. It was not a main hangar, more likely a small private port for high-ranking officials. If they could commandeer a craft, perhaps they could flee the planet. Alert klaxons still blared. They hurried down the twisting stairs, encountering only a handful of security servitors that they disabled quickly. The docking bay was protected by an energy shield. Inside, they saw several sleek Imperial shuttles, each with heavy lift capability and warp lance weaponry. Only a skeleton crew manned this area, apparently because the main battle still raged in other sections of the palace. The infiltration team attacked swiftly, disabling or killing the few defenders. Lara worked feverishly at a control station, lowering the energy shield. The robed woman urged them to hurry, claiming an inbound custode squad was close behind. Within minutes, the infiltration team boarded a small but swift Imperial shuttle, sleek and black, possibly belonging to an inquisitorial retinue. Falsotek slid into the pilot's seat. Though Tau were unfamiliar with the craft's exact controls, his advanced tactical training and the Earthcast's knowledge helped him figure out the basics. Engines roared, the shuttle rising on thrusters. Guards below fired shots, but the Tau returned fire from the shuttle's nose cannons, scattering them. Falsotek engaged full thrust, blasting out of the docking bay into the open sky above Terra's sprawling hive spires. Towers stretched in every direction, and anti-air batteries pivoted in search of them. The infiltration team soared between spires, hugging the cityscape. Soon, Imperial fighters shrieked overhead, scanning for the fleeing Xenos craft. The Tau pilot wove an erratic path, hoping to exploit the chaos of the ongoing incursion. The robed woman assisted, feeding him routes that avoided the brunt of the Imperial defenses, as though she had memorized partial flight codes. More than once, shrieking loss beams from anti-air turrets scorched the shuttle's hull, but somehow they stayed aloft. Beyond the hive spires, a massive defense perimeter stood, ring after ring of void shields and orbital weaponry. The infiltration team would never get past that in a standard Imperial shuttle alone. They had to rejoin the Tau ships that were still concealed in the system. Luckily, prior to infiltration, Falsotek had designated a fallback rendezvous point at one of Terra's lesser-known polar defense stations. It was perilously close to an array of sensor outposts, but if they could slip in undetected for even a moment, the light of the SNAR might be able to swoop in for a rescue. Desperate times, desperate measures. They angled the shuttle for Terra's upper atmosphere, climbing steeply. Alarms indicated that the Imperium's air defenses had locked onto them. A volley of missile contrails streaked across the sky, forcing Falsotek to dive and weave. The infiltration team, strapped in, braced for every jolt. The robed woman clutched a railing, silent except for her labored breathing. Above them, enormous orbital defense platforms glimmered, each capable of erasing any vessel that lacked official clearance. The Tau infiltration suits had managed to harvest some Imperial transponder codes, but they were outdated and partial at best. The shuttle soared higher, the curvature of Terra visible through the cockpit windows. Streaks of heavy ordnance whistled by. Lara transmitted frantic signals in Tau code, hoping to reach the hidden Tau fleet. At first, there was only static. Then a faint voice crackled through. "Commander, we detect your signal. Engaging stealth approach. Maintain course." Relief blossomed among the infiltration team. Maybe they had a chance. But the Imperium was not about to let a Xenos infiltration go unpunished. Orbital sensors locked onto the fleeing shuttle. A bright shaft of light speared down from a defense station, an immense lance beam that sliced through the air. Falsotek pulled every maneuver he could, but the beam clipped the shuttle's rear thrusters, sending them into a tailspin. The craft rattled violently, alarms howling. They lost altitude, spinning toward a roiling bank of clouds. Imperial fighters dove in behind them, unleashing bursts of autocannon fire. The infiltration team returned fire with the shuttle's rear turret, but the craft's stability was compromised. Warnings blared that the engines were about to fail. Then, in a flash of brilliant cyan, a Tau starship decloaked above them. It was one of the escorts that had accompanied the light of VSNAR, fitted with experimental stealth fields and anti-grav thrusters. The starship unleashed a volley of ion blasts that scattered the Imperial fighters. At the same moment, it locked onto the infiltration shuttle with a tractor beam, stabilizing their tumble. The infiltration team felt a jolt as the alien beam seized them, halting their plunge. Over the comm, a Tau pilot voice barked for them to brace. The infiltration shuttle was reeled into the starship's hold, the docking clamps sealing it inside. A moment later, the Tau vessel re-engaged its cloak, vanishing from Imperial sensors in a shimmering wave. The Imperial fighters spun frantically, searching for a target that was no longer there. Inside the Tau starship's hold, the infiltration team collapsed with relief. The robed woman stared around at the advanced Tau technology, awe flickering in her eyes. Medics rushed forward, tending to the infiltration team's injuries. Falsotek, battered but alive, pressed a trembling hand to Lara's shoulder. She nodded, pulling out the data wafer she had secured. "We have it," she breathed. The partial data on the Golden Throne systems. Exhaustion weighed on them all, but triumph glimmered faintly. They had not sabotaged the Emperor's seat, nor had they fully unraveled its mysteries. But they had seen it with their own eyes, recorded what they could, and escaped Terra. A feat few would believe possible. The Tau starship's commander informed them that the infiltration had stirred up the Hornet's nest. The entire system was now locked down. Imperial warfleets converged, scanning for Tau craft. The infiltration team would have to navigate a perilous route out of the Sol system, relying on every stealth trick they possessed. Yet there was hope. Even if the Imperium discovered the infiltration, which they surely had by now, the Tau had gleaned a priceless secret. The Golden Throne was a failing device, reliant on the Emperor's waning psychic might. The day might come when the Tau could exploit that vulnerability. As the starship eased into silent mode, drifting under minimal power, Falsotek gazed out a porthole at the swirling madness of the Sol system. He reflected on what they had seen, the horrifying majesty of the Emperor's body, the monstrous contraption that kept him alive, and the unstoppable fury of his guardians. It was a civilization teetering on the brink, held aloft by ancient technology and half-forgotten faith. The Tau had only just survived the perimeter of that fortress. Yet he could not help but feel the faintest stir of pity and awe. Once the Tau fleet regrouped in the outer reaches of the system, they prepared for a final warp jump out of Sol. Every moment was fraught with danger, as the Imperium scoured the sector for any Xenos presence. At last, the Tau starships slipped into the warp, their experimental drives humming quietly. Terra and its unstoppable guardians receded into the darkness behind them. They had done the unthinkable. They had walked upon the cradle of humanity, glimpsed the God Emperor enthroned, and survived to tell the tale. Days later, the infiltration team found themselves back in Tau-controlled space, aboard the light of VSNAR. The robed woman who had helped them introduced herself as a rogue Imperial savant, a historian of sorts, with deep knowledge of the Mechanicus's darkest secrets. She professed a desire to join the Tau for reasons of her own, perhaps vengeance against the Imperium, perhaps the pursuit of knowledge. Falsotek greeted her warily but recognized her value. The Ethereal Council would likely have a use for such a defector. In time, perhaps she would become Gyuvesa, a trusted ally. But for now, trust was not freely given. The infiltration data, when turned over to the Earthcast, sparked immediate, fervent research. The Tau scientists and engineers pored over the partial logs, deciphering fragments of code that spoke of the Golden Throne's layered systems. They found references to advanced psychoreactive circuits, something that allowed the Emperor's mind, or what remained of it, to manipulate the warp in a stable manner. The Tau were no strangers to the warp. They had encountered it, they knew its dangers, but never had they seen technology that could so effectively harness a psychic beacon on such a scale. Earthcast debates raged day and night, searching for a method to replicate or counter the throne's function. Some believed they might develop a microastronomicon for Tau fleets, guiding them through warp routes more safely. Others proposed sabotage. If the Tau learned the throne's weaknesses, they could plan a targeted strike that would throw the Imperium into chaos. The Ethereal Council convened to decide how best to employ this knowledge. The Tau were not wanton destroyers. They believed in assimilation, not extermination. Yet the Imperium's cruelty and fanaticism left few openings for peaceful coexistence. Perhaps weakening the throne would force the Imperium to the negotiation table. Perhaps not. While these deliberations continued, Commander Falsotek found himself summoned by the highest ethereals. He stood in a vast white chamber, luminous with Tau architectural elegance. The robed ethereals, their presence commanding, asked him to recount every detail of the infiltration. He spared nothing, from the infiltration suit's illusions to the presence of the unstoppable custodes to the dire sight of the Emperor's decaying form. When he described the Emperor's psychic aura, a hush fell. Tau had always found it difficult to grasp the concept of souls and gods, yet even Falsotek could not deny the raw presence that emanated from the corpse upon the throne. The ethereals murmured to each other, exchanging somber glances. At the end of the debriefing, one of the senior ethereals placed a gentle hand on Falsotek's shoulder, praising him for his daring and for returning with such critical knowledge. But the ethereal's eyes were grave, as though burdened by the weight of the Tau Empire's future. This infiltration had been a bold stroke, but it would surely enrage the Imperium if they ever learned who was responsible. The Tau must be ready for retaliation. Still, knowledge was power, and now the Tau possessed a secret that might one day shift the balance of the galaxy. Weeks turned into months. Earthcast engineers made incremental progress decoding the partial data. They uncovered references to anima vitae circuits, bridging the Emperor's latent consciousness with the psychic energies of thousands of sacrificed souls. They confirmed that the throne's architecture had been partially built by the Emperor himself, back in the days of the Great Crusade, and it had been modified many times since. Some sections were so archaic that even the Mechanicus barely understood how they functioned. This labyrinth of partial knowledge hinted that the Golden Throne was not only failing, but might eventually fail catastrophically if certain components gave out. In light of these findings, the Tau High Command considered their next moves carefully. An outright strike on Terra was unthinkable. Too many defenses, too many unknowns. They had barely escaped the last time. Instead, some proposed a more subtle campaign, seeding discontent among humanity by sabotaging the flow of Psykers to Terra, or by misdirecting Mechanicus supply lines. If enough cracks formed in the Imperium's armor, perhaps the Tau could expand unchallenged. But others argued that, rather than sabotage, the Tau should find a way to replicate the throne's beneficial aspects. If the Tau possessed a stable warp beacon of their own, they would no longer be at the Imperium's mercy when it came to traveling the galaxy. The Tau might one day stand as equals or superiors on the galactic stage. Some of the Earth caste quietly speculated about the possibility of capturing a human psyker population to power such a device, but that line of thought was morally repellent to many Tau. The Tau prized the greater good, not repeating the Imperium's brutal sacrifices. And so the question remained unsolved. For Commander Falsotek, the mission had changed him. His nights were plagued by memories of that silent figure on the throne, the overwhelming aura of psychic might that had nearly snuffed out his sense of self. He did not believe in gods, but he had felt something truly massive in that chamber, an echo that lingered in his mind. He confided in Lara, who admitted she too was haunted by the Emperor's presence. There was a quiet fear that they might have awakened something, or that in glimpsing the Emperor so closely, a piece of them had been indelibly changed. Yet they pressed on, determined to serve the Tau. Months later, the Tau Empire remained outwardly the same, still forging alliances, still repelling Orc incursions, still negotiating with factions of the Eldari. But beneath the surface, a new current of ambition coursed through Tau leadership. Whispers hinted that a new wave of research might yield breakthroughs in warp navigation. Some rumored that the Tau might attempt a more dramatic infiltration one day, perhaps with the assistance of disaffected Imperial insiders. Others speculated that the Tau might wait for the Emperor's eventual demise, if such a thing was possible, and then capitalize on the chaos. The entire galaxy, after all, seemed to revolve around the Golden Throne. The robed woman who had guided them to escape Terra proved instrumental in interpreting the data. She had once belonged to some obscure Mechanica splinter group, exiled for her heretical views on synthetic intelligence. Now, she served as a bridge between Tau technology and Mechanica secrets. Though she remained cryptic about her motivations, she encouraged the Tau to gather more data. She hinted that the Imperium had hidden away entire repositories of knowledge pertaining to the Emperor's earliest experiments, and that the Golden Throne was but one piece of a grander puzzle involving the Emperor's original plan for humanity's ascendancy. If the Tau could piece that puzzle together, they might shape the galaxy's destiny. Meanwhile, in the Imperium, an uproar ensued. Word of an infiltration on Terra was hushed up, but rumors trickled through the Imperial ranks that Xenos agents had actually glimpsed the Emperor. Some believed it was the work of chaos. Others suspected an advanced Eldari infiltration. Hardly anyone imagined that it could be the Tau, those upstart aliens, still believed to be small in number and contained at the Empire's fringe. Yet the custodes who had fought the intruders knew the truth. They remained silent, handing over the matter to the Inquisition, who began a quiet but thorough investigation, hunting any trace of Tau infiltration in the Sol system. The entire palace was locked down for months, searching for sabotage or hidden devices. They found remains of advanced Xenos illusions, but no full explanation. Rage burned in the hearts of the custodes, for to trespass upon the Emperor's presence was the gravest of sins. Vengeance was only a matter of time. But the Tau were far beyond the Imperium's immediate reach, huddled in their own domain. While the Imperium's wars raged on many fronts, against chaos, against Orcs, against Eldari corsairs, the infiltration of Terra was but a footnote in the tide of galactic conflict. Still, for those in the highest echelons of Imperial power, the memory burned. The Xenos had discovered something. They had dared to lay eyes upon the Emperor. That alone was unthinkable. The High Lords of Terra whispered in council chambers that perhaps the Tau represented a greater threat than previously believed. Perhaps a crusade against them would be necessary. But the Imperium was ever stretched thin, its armies locked in countless struggles. For the moment, it seemed impossible to dispatch an entire Segmentum fleet to deal with the Tau. So the infiltration lingered as a horrifying possibility. If it could happen once, it could happen again. And so the galaxy spun on. In the Tau Empire, the infiltration team became legends among certain Firecast cadres, whispered about with awe and disbelief. Falsotek quietly accepted the accolades but warned others that the cost had been high. Many good Tau had perished before the unstoppable might of the custodes. He emphasized that any future infiltration of Terra would require even greater cunning, or a fundamental shift in the balance of power. Behind closed doors, the Earthcast toiled over the partial throne data, forging new prototypes of psychoreactive technology. They struggled to understand the concept of a soul, let alone how to harness it for warp navigation. Some saw it as an impossible dream, doomed to fail without widespread cruelty. Others believed the Taoist scientific principles might find a more ethical solution than the Imperium's daily consumption of psychers. As for the Ethereals, they debated how best to shape Tao policy. Some advocated caution, fearing that overt moves against the Imperium would provoke retribution on a scale the Tao could not withstand. Others, emboldened by the infiltration's success, pressed for a more aggressive approach, arguing that the Imperium's weak points should be targeted. The debate raged in secret councils. In the end, the Ethereal Council reached a compromise. They would maintain a veneer of diplomatic overtures where possible, keep expanding methodically, and simultaneously sponsor covert research aimed at exploiting the throne's weaknesses. Should the Imperium ever falter, the Tao would be ready to advance the greater good. And what of the Emperor's Watchers, the Adeptus Custodes, and the robed Adeptus Mechanicus? They continued day after day, week after week, performing the unending rituals that kept the Emperor's body alive. Whispers lingered about the infiltration, fueling an undercurrent of paranoia. No one spoke openly of the Emperor's failing life support or the hairline cracks in the throne's psychocircuitry. None dared speak of the Tao infiltration that had glimpsed the Emperor. Yet the threat was real. For all their might, the Imperium was not invulnerable. A shadow had passed over Terra, leaving behind echoes that might one day become the downfall of an empire spanning millennia. In the Tao Empire, as the infiltration data slowly bore fruit, Falsotek often paced the observation deck of the light of Yesenar, gazing at the stars. The memory of the Emperor's silent form on that golden seat continued to haunt him. He could not shake the sense that what he had witnessed was more than just a decaying relic of ancient times. It was the linchpin of a vast, intertwined destiny. A story that had begun long before the Tao discovered the stars. A story of human ambition, betrayal, and triumph. But now that story intertwined with the Taoist's own. He wondered what price the Tao might pay for meddling in such ancient designs. He was not alone in these thoughts. Lara, the Gyuvesa scribe, confided her own conflicted feelings. She had once prayed to the Emperor, back when she was part of the Imperium. Though she had renounced that faith, seeing him in the flesh or what remained of it, brought old emotions surging to the surface. Was he truly a god, or just a man kept alive by blasphemous technology? She had no answers. She only knew that her loyalties now lay with the Tao, and that the Imperium's cruelty drove her away. Yet some nights, she dreamed of an infinite golden light, a presence that weighed upon her soul, judging her for her betrayal. She would awake, trembling, uncertain whether it was guilt or a vestigial psychic connection to the Emperor's grand design. The Tao had no answers for such mysteries, but the Tao Empire marched onward. Each caste performed its duties: fire, earth, air, water, and the guiding ethereals, moving toward a new era. The infiltration of Terra had set the stage for a slow but seismic shift in the balance of power. No longer were the Tao wholly ignorant of the Imperium's greatest secret. They had seen the Emperor, studied the throne, and survived to bring back its echoes. Even if the knowledge was incomplete, even if replicating or undermining the throne was years or decades away, the Tao had taken a monumental step. Perhaps, in time, they would realize the full implications of what they had done. Still, none could deny that the Imperium's spirit was entwined with the Emperor's unwavering will. Even a failing corpse on the throne could command unwavering loyalty from billions. Commander Falsotek wondered if that devotion was the Imperium's true strength. Faith so absolute it defied reason. The Tao prided themselves on rationality, on the greater good. Could that ideology ever stand against such fanatical worship? He hoped that knowledge would be the deciding factor, that reason would triumph. But a corner of his mind remained uneasy, recalling the golden flash of the Custode's spear, the unstoppable fury in their eyes, the monstrous might of a system that had endured for 10,000 years. In quiet hours, Falsotek would stare into the void, imagining the future. He saw conflict spanning centuries, perhaps culminating in an ultimate confrontation between the Tao and the Imperium. He saw the possibility of forging alliances with other Xenos races, or perhaps with rebellious human worlds that chafed under the Imperium's yoke. He imagined Tao starships traveling swiftly across the warp, guided by a new technology born from stolen throne data. He also imagined the Imperium launching a crippling crusade against the Tau, spurred by outraged custodes or the unstoppable might of one of the Emperor's prime arcs, if any yet walked. So many uncertain paths stretched out before them all. For now, the infiltration team saga became a quiet legend. The Tau Empire went about its affairs, continuing expansions on the eastern fringe, forging pacts with or subduing minor Xenos, ever mindful that the Imperium might come for them. In hidden laboratories, Earth-caste scientists continued dissecting the scraps of the Golden Throne's architecture. The robed woman, that rogue savant, aided them with cryptic references to the Emperor's design, sometimes quoting from ancient texts that spoke of a web of suns and the keys of ascension. She insisted there was more to discover, that the Tau might find real answers in other forbidden vaults scattered across human space. Whether her words were truth or manipulation, no one could say. And so the Tau Empire stood on the threshold of unprecedented knowledge that could reshape the galaxy or plunge it into new depths of war. They had discovered the Golden Throne, beheld it with their own eyes, and lived to share what they had learned. Whether this path would lead to the Tau's ascendancy or to a final conflict that would destroy them, none could say. But one thing was certain. The Tau had taken a bold stride into the domain that humans claimed as sacred, and in so doing, they had changed the future forever. In a lonely meditation chamber aboard the light of VSNAR, Commander Falsotek reflected on the mission's cost. He remembered each comrade lost, each gamble made. He recalled the Emperor's silent visage, the radiant aura that almost consumed his senses. As he stared into the starlit void, he murmured the Tau motto, "For the greater good." Despite all he had witnessed, he believed in those words, believed the Tau's destiny was to bring unity to a fractured galaxy. The infiltration of the Golden Throne was but the first step in a journey that would challenge the boundaries of faith, reason, and survival. And so the Tau ventured on, forever changed by the knowledge of a gilded seat that held a rotting god-king in thrall. Perhaps, in some distant epoch, the galaxy would look back on that infiltration as the turning point, the moment the Tau set their eyes on humanity's darkest secret, determined to bring about a new order. Until then, the stars shone on, indifferent to the ambitions of mortal beings. Yet the Tau, guided by the greater good, pressed forward into the unknown, carrying with them the silent echoes of the Emperor's heartbeat, pulsing from a golden throne that might yet shape the fate of every living soul in the cosmos.